Imagine standing in East Africa 2 million years ago. The landscape stretches before you, golden grasslands punctuated by acacia trees, volcanic peaks rising in the distance, the sound of animals everywhere, lions hunting in the early morning light, herds of antelope grazing across the plains, and somewhere in the trees at the forest edge, moving carefully through the shadows, something that's not quite animal anymore. Not quite human either. Something in between. They're walking upright, which is unusual for primates. Their hands are free, holding rocks they've shaped into crude tools. Their eyes scan the horizon with an intelligence that seems different from the other animals. They communicate in grunts and gestures that might be language, or might just be elaborate coordination. They're our ancestors, the first members of the genus Homo, and they're about to embark on the most remarkable journey in the history of life on Earth. But here's the thing, we don't really know them. We have fragments of bone, scattered stone tools, a few footprints preserved in volcanic ash. From these scraps of evidence, we're trying to reconstruct the entire story of human prehistory, millions of years of evolution, migration, innovation, survival against impossible odds. And most of that story is lost, hidden in gaps we'll never fill, buried under rock and time and the relentless erasure of the geological record. Tonight, we're going to explore those gaps, the missing chapters in human prehistory, the enormous spaces between the few fossils we've found, the millions of years where we can only guess what our ancestors were doing, where they were going, how they survived. We'll follow the trail from the first upright apes to the emergence of modern humans. We'll track migrations that took our species to every corner of the planet. We'll examine the mysteries that still haunt archaeologists and paleontologists when they're honest about how little we actually know. If you're using this to help you sleep, perfect. That's exactly why I make these. Hit subscribe and tell me where you're watching from in the comments. I love seeing the different time zones. Tokyo at dawn, Berlin at midnight, Sao Paulo in the afternoon. All of us wondering about the same ancient questions. Here's what makes human prehistory so frustrating and fascinating. Unlike dinosaurs, which dominated Earth for 165 million years and left fossils everywhere, human evolution happened fast. Really fast. The entire story, from the first upright ape to modern humans, covers maybe 7 million years. And for most of that time, there weren't that many of us. Small populations scattered across Africa, and later other continents. Small populations don't leave many fossils, and the fossils they do leave are incredibly difficult to find. Think about it. A fossil requires a dead organism to be buried quickly before scavengers destroy it. Then it needs the right chemical conditions to mineralize. Then it needs to survive millions of years of geological upheaval without being crushed, melted, or eroded away. Then it needs to be exposed by erosion at exactly the right time when humans are around to find it. And then it needs to be found by someone who recognizes it as important. The odds are astronomical, which means everything we know about human prehistory is based on an absurdly small sample size. All the human fossils ever found from all species, across all of human evolution, would fit in the back of a pickup truck. We're reconstructing millions of years of history from fragments of bone that could be carried by one person. Every new discovery has the potential to rewrite the textbooks, and the gaps, the spaces where we simply have no evidence at all, those gaps are enormous. So, let's be clear from the start. This isn't a story where I'm going to tell you exactly what happened. Nobody can do that. This is a story about what we think might have happened based on the tiny fraction of evidence that survived, and about the huge blank spaces where we're just guessing, where we'll probably always be guessing because the evidence is gone, destroyed by 2 million years of geological violence. But that's what makes it compelling, isn't it? The mystery, the uncertainty, the fact that somewhere in Africa, right now, there might be a fossil waiting to be discovered that will completely change our understanding of human origins. The fact that our entire species' history is mostly unknown, mostly unknowable, and we're doing our best to piece it together from fragments. Let's start at the beginning, or at least what we think might be the beginning. Around 7 million years ago, somewhere in Africa, the last common ancestor of humans and chimpanzees lived. We don't know what they looked like. We've never found their fossils. We're not even sure exactly when they existed. The 7 million year estimate comes from genetic analysis comparing modern human and chimpanzee DNA and using molecular clock calculations to estimate when the lineages split. But molecular clocks are notoriously imprecise for recent evolutionary events. The actual split could have been 10 million years ago, or 5 million years ago, or anywhere in between. What we do know is that sometime in the late Miocene, the African climate was changing. Forests that had covered much of the continent were shrinking. Grasslands were expanding, and some populations of apes found themselves spending more time on the ground rather than in the trees. This is where the human story begins. Not with some grand decision to become human, just with climate change gradually transforming habitat and populations adapting to new conditions in whatever ways allowed them to survive. The earliest possible human ancestor we've found is Sahelanthropus chidensis, a skull discovered in Chad in 2001, dated to about 7 million years ago. It's got a flat face and small canine teeth, features associated with bipedalism. But we only have a skull. We don't have the rest of the skeleton, so we can't actually confirm whether Sahelanthropus walked upright or not. It might be a human ancestor. It might be an extinct ape. It might be something else entirely. We don't know. Then there's Orrorin tugenensis from Kenya, dated to about 6 million years ago. We have some femur bones that suggest bipedalism, but again, very fragmentary fossils. And Ardipithecus cadaver from Ethiopia, around 5.8 million years ago, known from teeth and a few bone fragments. Are these human ancestors? Maybe. Probably. But the fossils are too incomplete to be certain. We're looking at the very beginning of the human lineage, and the evidence is maddeningly sparse. The first reasonably complete skeleton we have is Ardipithecus ramidus, known from multiple fossils found in Ethiopia, dated to 4.4 million years ago. And even this fossil, nicknamed Ardi, sparked enormous controversy when it was fully described in 2009, because it didn't look like scientists expected. Ardi could walk upright, but she still had opposable big toes adapted for grasping tree branches. She had small canine teeth, like later humans, but her skull and hands looked more ape-like. She was a mixture, a mosaic of primitive and derived features that didn't fit neatly into anyone's model of how humans evolved. This is the problem with human evolution. Every time we find a new fossil, it complicates the story rather than simplifying it. We keep expecting to find a nice linear progression from primitive to advanced, from ape to human, but evolution doesn't work that way. It's messy, it's branching, Species evolve different traits at different rates. They overlap in time and space. They probably interbred. The neat family tree we drew in old textbooks is more like a tangled bush, with branches going in all directions, and most of them ending in extinction. After Ardipithecus, we get to the Australopithecines, the southern apes, living between about 4 million and 2 million years ago. And this is where the human fossil record becomes slightly less fragmentary. Slightly. We have dozens of fossils from multiple species across several million years, which sounds like a lot until you remember we're talking about populations that probably numbered in the thousands spread across an entire continent over 2 million years. Dozens of fossils is nothing. The most famous Australopithecine is Lucy, a partial skeleton of Australopithecus afarensis, found in Ethiopia in 1974. She's about 3.2 million years old and represents roughly 40% of a complete skeleton, which in paleoanthropology counts as an incredible find. Most human fossils are just fragments, a jawbone here, a skull cap there. Lucy gave us enough bones to reconstruct how these early human ancestors moved, how tall they were, how their bodies were built. She was about 3.5 feet tall, walked upright, but probably still spent significant time in trees, had a brain about the size of a chimpanzee's, and lived in a world where being small and adaptable was the key to survival. But here's what keeps me up at night about Lucy and all the Australopithecines. We have maybe 400 fossil specimens from all Australopithecine species combined. 400 individuals across multiple species spanning 2 million years. That's one fossil for every 5,000 years on average. The gaps between fossils are enormous. We don't know how these species lived day to day. We don't know how their behavior changed over hundreds of thousands of years. We don't know how they interacted with each other or with other species. We have snapshots, brief frozen moments, and we're trying to reconstruct a movie. The Australopithecines weren't just one species evolving into humans. They were a whole radiation of species, at least 7 or 8 that we know about, probably more that we haven't found yet. Australopithecus anamensis, afarensis, africanus, Garhi, Sediba, Paranthropus ethiopicus, Boise, robustus, each with slightly different adaptations. Some had massive jaws and huge molar teeth for grinding tough vegetation. Some were more gracile with smaller teeth, suggesting a more varied diet. Some lived in forests, some on grasslands, some near lakes and rivers. They overlapped in time and space. Multiple species coexisting in the same regions, probably competing for resources, maybe occasionally interbreeding, definitely aware of each other. Imagine being a member of Australopithecus africanus and encountering a group of Paranthropus robustus at a waterhole. They're clearly related to you, obviously, but they're different. Bigger, stockier, with enormous jaws and teeth. Are they dangerous? Are they competitors? Do you communicate with them somehow? We'll never know. Those interactions happened millions of times, over hundreds of thousands of years, and not one of them left any evidence we can find. Around 2.8 million years ago, something changed. The climate was getting drier. The forests were shrinking even more. Grasslands dominated, and we start seeing the first fossils that paleontologists classify in the genus Homo, the same genus we belong to. The earliest is Homo habilis, the handyman, named because they're found with stone tools. These are the oldest undisputed stone tools we have, dated to about 2.6 million years ago. Simple flakes struck off cores to create sharp cutting edges, but sophisticated enough to require skill and planning to make. Homo habilis had slightly larger brains than the Australopithecines, about 600 cubic centimeters compared to 450. They had more human-like hands, capable of precision grip. They had slightly smaller teeth, suggesting a diet that included more meat. But they were still small, maybe 4 feet tall, still probably spent time in trees, still had many primitive features. They weren't quite us yet. They were something in between. And here's where the story gets really complicated, because Homo habilis might not even be a real species. The fossils assigned to Homo habilis are highly variable. Some researchers think they represent multiple species that we're lumping together because we don't have enough fossils to tell them apart. Other researchers think Homo habilis should be reclassified as an Australopithecine because it's too primitive to be truly human. The debate continues. The fossils are too fragmentary to resolve it definitively. What we do know is that around 2 million years ago, the first members of our genus were making stone tools, eating meat regularly, and beginning to look more human and less ape-like. Their brains were growing. Their bodies were adapting to life on the ground rather than in trees. They were becoming something new. But exactly how this happened, which species led to which, what drove these changes, we're still arguing about all of it. Then, around 1.9 million years ago, we get Homo erectus, upright man. And this is where things get interesting, because Homo erectus is recognizably human. Not modern human, but clearly no longer an ape. They stood about 5 to 6 feet tall. They had brains averaging 900 cubic centimeters, about 2/3 the size of modern humans. They had long legs and short arms, adapted for efficient long-distance walking. They had relatively small teeth, suggesting they were cooking their food. And most remarkably, they were the first human species to leave Africa. Homo erectus fossils have been found across Africa, Asia, and even Indonesia. They spread farther than any previous human species. They adapted to different environments, from tropical forests to temperate woodlands. They survived for an incredibly long time. The species lasted from about 1.9 million years ago to possibly as recently as 110,000 years ago. That's 1.8 million years of existence, making Homo erectus by far the most successful human species that ever lived. Our own species, Homo sapiens, has only been around for 300,000 years. We've got a long way to go before we match Homo erectus's longevity. But here's the puzzle. For all their success, for all their longevity, for all their spread across multiple continents, Homo erectus stone tool technology barely changed. They developed a tool called the Acheulean hand axe around 1.7 million years ago, a large teardrop-shaped tool that required considerable skill to make. And then they kept making essentially the same tool for over 1 million years. Hand axes from 1.7 million years ago look almost identical to hand axes from 300,000 years ago. The same design, the same manufacturing technique, for 1 million years. Modern humans innovate constantly. Our technology changes within generations. We can't imagine using the same tools for even a century without improvement. But Homo erectus made the same hand axe for 1 million years and seemed perfectly content with it. What does that tell us about their minds, about their culture, about how they thought? We don't know. It's one of the great mysteries of human evolution. Were they simply less inventive than modern humans? Did they lack some cognitive capacity that we have? Or did they just find a design that worked so well there was no pressure to change it? We can speculate, but the answer is lost in time. Around 700,000 years ago, things start getting complicated again. We begin seeing fossils in Europe and Africa that are different from Homo erectus. Bigger brains, more modern-looking skulls, but still not quite like us. Paleontologists argue endlessly about what to call these fossils. Some group them as Homo heidelbergensis, Heidelberg man, supposedly ancestral to both Neanderthals and modern humans. Others split them into multiple species, Homo antecessor in Spain, Homo rhodesiensis in Africa. The taxonomy is a mess. We don't have enough fossils to clarify the relationships. We don't even agree on how many species there were. What we do know is that human evolution was speeding up. Brain sizes were increasing. Stone tool technology was becoming more sophisticated. Fire was being used regularly by at least 400,000 years ago, and probably much earlier. Humans were hunting large game cooperatively. They were living in more complex social groups. Something was happening. Something was driving human brains to get bigger and human behavior to get more complex. But what? Climate change? Social competition? Diet? Language development? All of the above. The fossils can't tell us. By 400,000 years ago, we start seeing the ancestors of Neanderthals appearing in Europe. And by 130,000 years ago, we have full Neanderthals, Homo neanderthalensis, perfectly adapted to the cold conditions of Ice Age Europe. They had stocky bodies for conserving heat. They had large noses for warming cold air before it reached their lungs. They had enormous brains, actually slightly larger on average than modern humans. They made sophisticated stone tools. They hunted large game like mammoths and woolly rhinoceroses. They buried their dead. They probably had language. They might have created art. They were smart. They were capable. They were successful. And for over 100,000 years, they dominated Europe and parts of Western Asia. Meanwhile, in Africa, something else was happening. Around 300,000 years ago, fossils appear that paleontologists classify as early Homo sapiens, our species. These early modern humans looked somewhat different from us. They had slightly more robust faces, larger brow ridges, slightly differently shaped skulls. But they were clearly more like us than like any other human species. Their brains were modern human size. Their bodies were modern human shape. If you could bring them forward in time, clean them up, dress them in modern clothes, they'd look a bit unusual, but definitely human. For the next 200,000 years, these early modern humans lived in Africa and didn't do much that was particularly impressive archaeologically. They made stone tools, but so did Neanderthals. They hunted and gathered. They probably had language, though we can't prove it. They may have created some simple art and jewelry, but the evidence is sparse. They weren't obviously superior to Neanderthals or other human species. They were just another human lineage, probably barely more numerous than their cousins, probably struggling to survive in a world full of dangerous predators and competing human species. Then, around 70,000 years ago, something changed. The archaeological record shows a sudden explosion of innovation, sophisticated tools, long-distance trade networks, elaborate art and jewelry, evidence of ritual behavior, complex social organization. Scientists call this the cognitive revolution, or the Great Leap Forward. And it marks the moment when modern humans stopped being just another human species and started becoming the species that would eventually dominate the entire planet. What caused this change? We don't know for certain. Some researchers think a genetic mutation improved language abilities, or abstract thinking. Others think it was cultural rather than biological. the accumulation of knowledge reaching some critical threshold that allowed rapid innovation. Others think it was triggered by population pressures or climate change or contact with other human species. The debate continues. The evidence is maddeningly ambiguous. What we do know is that after 70,000 years ago, modern humans started spreading out of Africa. They moved into the Middle East, where they encountered Neanderthals. They moved into Asia, where they encountered Denisovans, another human species we only discovered in 2010 from DNA extracted from a finger bone found in a Siberian cave. They moved into Southeast Asia and eventually Australia, becoming the first humans to reach that continent. They moved into Europe, displacing or absorbing the Neanderthals. They spread across Asia and eventually crossed into the Americas, though when and how remains hotly debated. And everywhere they went, something strange happened. The other human species disappeared. Neanderthals went extinct around 40,000 years ago. Denisovans vanished around the same time. Other archaic human populations in Asia and Africa that we only know from a few fossils or from DNA traces all disappeared between 50,000 and 30,000 years ago. By 30,000 years ago, we were alone, the only human species left on Earth. Did we kill them, outcompete them for resources, absorb them through interbreeding, some combination of all three? The evidence suggests complicated interactions. We know modern humans interbred with Neanderthals because non-African people today carry 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. We know we interbred with Denisovans because people in Melanesia and Australia carry Denisovan DNA. These species were compatible enough to produce fertile offspring. So, some absorption definitely occurred, but interbreeding alone can't explain why they disappeared. If Neanderthals and modern humans were interbreeding regularly, we should see a gradual blending of populations. Instead, we see Neanderthal distinct populations disappearing over a few thousand years. That suggests competition and displacement, not peaceful integration. Something about modern humans gave us an advantage. Maybe slightly better technology, maybe more flexible behavior, maybe more efficient group coordination, maybe just slightly higher birth rates compounding over generations. Whatever it was enough. Enough to ensure that by the end of the Ice Age, only one human species remained. Now, you might be thinking, this doesn't sound like there are huge gaps. We seem to know quite a lot about human evolution, and that's true on the broad strokes. We know, approximately, when different human species appeared and disappeared. We know roughly where they lived. We can track major migrations and the spread of stone tool technologies. But here's the thing. All of this knowledge is based on maybe 6,000 human fossils, total, from all species across 7 million years. And most of those fossils are fragmentary. A tooth here, a jaw fragment there, maybe a partial skull if we're lucky. The number of reasonably complete skeletons from the entire history of human evolution. Specimens where we have enough bones to really understand body proportions and how the individual moved, that number is less than 50. Across all species, across 7 million years, we have fewer complete fossil skeletons from the entire history of human evolution than you could fit in a small classroom. Everything else is extrapolation, interpolation, educated guessing based on fragmentary evidence. The gaps between fossils are measured in tens of thousands of years, sometimes hundreds of thousands of years. For example, between Australopithecus and Homo erectus, between about 2.5 and 1.9 million years ago, we have maybe a dozen partial fossils from Africa. 12 individuals to represent 600,000 years of evolution. That's one fossil every 50,000 years on average. Hundreds of thousands of generations lived and died without leaving any trace we've found. Did human evolution proceed smoothly during that time? Were there rapid bursts of change? Multiple competing species? We don't know. The fossils simply aren't there. Or consider the period between 400,000 and 200,000 years ago, when the ancestors of modern humans were diverging from the ancestors of Neanderthals. This is one of the most important transitions in human evolution, the moment when our lineage became distinct, and the African fossil record for this period is almost completely blank. We have a handful of fragmentary fossils that might represent early modern humans. We have some that might represent something more primitive. We can't even agree on what they are, because we don't have enough material to judge. The crucial period when Homo sapiens was emerging as a distinct species is hidden in a massive gap in the fossil record. The same problem exists for behavior and culture. Stone tools survive in the archaeological record reasonably well because they're stone. They don't decay. But everything else, clothing, shelters, wooden tools, rope, baskets, food, remains. Almost all of it is gone. Organic materials decay within years or decades, unless they're in exceptional preservation environments, like dry caves or frozen permafrost. This means we're trying to understand human behavior from essentially just the stone tools they left behind. Imagine trying to understand modern human culture by looking only at the metal objects we've made. You'd get a wildly incomplete and distorted picture. That's what we're dealing with for 99% of human prehistory. We don't know when language developed. We can make educated guesses based on brain size and skull anatomy, but we can't know for certain. Language doesn't fossilize. We don't know when humans started wearing clothing regularly. We can guess based on when we moved into cold climates, but earlier populations might have worn simple clothes that left no evidence. We don't know when humans discovered fire. We have evidence of fire use going back 400,000 years, and possibly much earlier. But was that controlled fire, or just opportunistic use of natural wildfires? We can't tell. We don't know what kind of social structures early humans had. Were they monogamous or polygamous? Did they have leaders, or were they egalitarian? How did they divide labor? How did they resolve conflicts? All of this is invisible in the archaeological record. We can study modern hunter-gatherers and make inferences, but modern hunter-gatherers have had just as much time to evolve culturally as we have. They're not living fossils. They're not windows into the past. They're modern people with modern cultures shaped by 100,000 years of their own history. We don't know how many human species there really were. We've found fossils that we've classified into about 20 different species, depending on how you count them. But those are just the ones we've found fossils of. Given how rare fossilization is, and how fragmentary the human fossil record is, there were almost certainly other human species that existed, but left no fossils that survived, or that we haven't found yet. We're probably missing entire branches of the human family tree. Whole species that arose, existed for hundreds of thousands of years, and went extinct without leaving evidence we've discovered. We don't know the population sizes of any extinct human species. We can make rough estimates based on genetic diversity in modern humans and extrapolate backward. But for species like Homo erectus or Neanderthals, we're basically guessing. Were there millions of them? Tens of thousands? The difference matters because it affects how we understand their extinction. A species with millions of individuals requires a different explanation for disappearance than a species that never numbered more than a few thousand. We don't know exactly when humans reached various parts of the world. The peopling of the IGN Americas is particularly controversial. For decades, the standard model said humans crossed from Siberia to Alaska about 13,000 years ago, after the ice sheets retreated. Then, archaeological sites started being discovered that might be older. Sites in South America dated to 15,000 or even 20,000 years ago. Now, some researchers are arguing for human presence in the Americas as early as 30,000 years ago, based on stone tools and possible hearth features. But many of these sites are controversial. Did humans really make those stone tools, or are they just naturally fractured rocks? Were those hearths really human-made, or just natural features? The debate is fierce because the evidence is ambiguous. The same uncertainty exists for human arrival in Australia. The consensus is around 50,000 to 65,000 years ago, but the dating is challenging, and some sites have produced older dates that are disputed. How humans got to Australia is also unclear. Did they build boats capable of crossing dozens of miles of open ocean? Did they island hop during periods of lower sea level? We know they got there somehow, but the actual route and method are lost to time. Even for Europe, where we have a relatively good archaeological record, there are huge gaps. We know Neanderthals and modern humans overlapped in Europe for several thousand years. We know modern humans eventually replaced Neanderthals completely. But the details of how this happened, where they interacted, whether there were territories exclusively controlled by one species or the other, whether interactions were mostly peaceful or mostly violent, all of this is speculation based on the sporadic distribution of fossils and artifacts. The last Neanderthals disappeared from their final refuges in southern Spain and Gibraltar around 40,000 years ago, but the exact timing is uncertain, and more importantly, we don't know why. Were they hunted to extinction by modern humans? Did modern humans outcompete them for food resources? Did modern humans bring diseases Neanderthals had no immunity to? Did climate change shift environments in ways that favored modern humans? Did interbreeding absorb them into the modern human population? All of these explanations have been proposed. All of them have some supporting evidence. None of them can be proven conclusively from the available fossils and artifacts. This is the reality of studying human prehistory. For every fact we know with reasonable certainty, there are a dozen questions we can't answer. For every fossil we've found, there are thousands that existed but didn't fossilize, or didn't survive, or haven't been discovered yet. For every archaeological site we've excavated, there are thousands more buried under cities, underwater due to sea level rise, or destroyed by erosion. We're working with a fragmentary record full of gaps we'll never fill. And yet, despite all these limitations, despite all the uncertainty, we've managed to piece together the broad outline of human evolution. We know humans evolved in Africa from ape ancestors. We know this process took millions of years and involved multiple species. We know various human species spread across the Old World, starting about 2 million years ago. We know modern humans emerged in Africa around 300,000 years ago and began spreading globally around 70,000 years ago. We know we're the last survivors of a once diverse human family. These are facts supported by enough evidence to be confident about them. Everything else, all the details, all the day-to-day lives of our ancestors, all the individual decisions and struggles and triumphs that led from them to us, most of that is lost, not temporarily lost, waiting to be discovered. Permanently lost, erased by time and geology and the simple fact that most things don't fossilize. We'll never know what it was like to be Homo erectus walking across Asia 1,000,000 years ago. We'll never know what Neanderthals thought about when they sat around fires in their Ice Age caves. We'll never know the names our ancestors called each other, or the stories they told, or the fears that kept them awake at night. But we can know this. They survived. Every single one of your ancestors, going back millions of years, survived long enough to reproduce. They survived predators and diseases, and climate shifts, and competition from other human species, and sheer bad luck. Billions of individuals lived and died over millions of years. And through all of it, an unbroken chain of survivors led from the first upright apes to you. That's not just interesting, that's profound. You're the current endpoint of the most successful lineage in the history of human evolution. Every other branch of the human family tree ended in extinction. Your branch didn't. You're here because of an unbroken chain of survival stretching back through deep time. Let's shift our focus now to one of the most fascinating and poorly understood aspects of human prehistory, the development of human cognition. Because here's a question that keeps researchers up at night. When did humans become, well, human? Not physically human, we know approximately when modern anatomy appeared, but mentally human. When did our ancestors develop the cognitive abilities that separate us from other animals, and even from other human species? When did we start thinking like us? The challenge is that thoughts don't fossilize. Brains don't fossilize. Neural structures decay within hours of death. We can measure skull capacity and estimate brain size from fossil skulls. But brain size doesn't tell us everything we need to know. Neanderthals had larger brains than modern humans on average, but they went extinct, and we didn't. Clearly, something about our brains was different or better, but what? We can't examine the brain tissue. We can't map the neural connections. We can only look at the products of those brains, the tools they made, the art they created, the evidence of their behavior, and try to work backward to what kind of mind could have produced those things. The earliest evidence of distinctly human-like cognition is hard to pin down. Stone tools appear around 3.3 million years ago, possibly made by Australopithecines, or early Homo species. But early stone tools were very simple. You take one rock and hit another rock to create sharp flakes. This requires some planning and skill, but many animals use tools. Chimpanzees use stones to crack nuts. Crows use sticks to fish for insects. Early stone tool use might not reflect uniquely human intelligence, just basic problem solving that other animals are capable of. Things get more interesting around 1.7 million years ago, with the appearance of Acheulean hand axes. These are much more sophisticated. They require careful planning, precise control of how you strike the stone, understanding of rock fracture mechanics. You need to be able to visualize the finished tool in your mind before you start making it, and adjust your technique as you go to achieve that vision. That requires a level of abstract thinking that seems beyond what we see in other animals. But remember, Homo erectus made essentially the same hand axe for over 1,000,000 years. There was no innovation, no improvement, no elaboration of the design. This suggests their cognitive abilities, while advanced enough to make complex tools, might have been limited in ways ours aren't. they could learn to make a complex tool and pass that knowledge to the next generation. But they couldn't or didn't innovate new tools or improve existing ones. Why? What cognitive ability did they lack that modern humans have? Some researchers think the key difference is language. Maybe Homo erectus had simple communication, enough to teach toolmaking through demonstration and basic instruction, but not full complex language, capable of expressing abstract ideas, hypothetical scenarios, or complex social relationships. Without sophisticated language, cultural knowledge couldn't accumulate as efficiently. Each generation would relearn mostly what the previous generation knew, without adding much new information. But we can't know when language developed, because language doesn't fossilize. We can look for physical features that are necessary for speech. The position of the larynx in the throat, which affects the range of sounds we can produce. The structure of the hyoid bone, which supports the tongue and larynx. The size of the spinal cord at chest level, which needs to be large enough to control the precise breathing required for speech. Neanderthals had all these features. They were physically capable of speech. But being physically capable of speech doesn't mean they had language as complex as ours. Some researchers have looked at the FOXP2 gene, which is involved in speech and language in modern humans. Neanderthals had the same version of FOXP2 that we have, suggesting they might have had language. But one gene doesn't tell us everything. Language is controlled by complex networks of genes and brain structures. Having one key gene doesn't necessarily mean having full modern language abilities. So, we're left guessing. Neanderthals probably had some form of language. They buried their dead, which suggests symbolic thinking. They made jewelry from shells and eagle talons, which suggests awareness of social status and personal identity. They created art, though less frequently and less elaborately than modern humans. They had complex hunting strategies requiring coordination, which suggests communication ability. But was their language as flexible and complex as ours? Did they have abstract concepts, metaphorical thinking, the ability to discuss things that aren't immediately present? We don't know. The evidence isn't there. The same frustrating uncertainty applies to other aspects of cognition. When did humans develop self-awareness? Theory of mind, the ability to understand that other people have thoughts and beliefs different from your own. Abstract mathematical thinking, the concept of time extending beyond immediate past and near future. All of these cognitive abilities are uniquely human, or at least much more developed in humans than in other animals. But we can't pinpoint when they appeared because they don't leave direct physical evidence. We can look at art and symbolism as proxies for complex cognition. The earliest undisputed art dates to around 40,000 years ago in Europe. Cave paintings, carved figurines, decorative objects. But absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Earlier art might have existed using materials that don't preserve. Wood carvings, body paint, arrangements of natural objects, all would leave no trace in the archaeological record. There's controversial evidence for much earlier art. Shells with holes drilled in them, suggesting use as beads, dated to 100,000 years ago or older. Pieces of ochre with geometric engravings from South Africa, possibly 70,000 years old. Abstract patterns carved into rock in Indonesia, possibly 500,000 years old, though that date is highly disputed. If these really are art or symbolic objects, they push back the timeline for complex cognition dramatically. But interpreting ancient objects is difficult. Were those shells deliberately drilled for use as ornaments, or did natural processes create the holes? Were those engravings deliberate patterns, or just random marks? The debate continues because the objects themselves can't tell us about the intentions of their makers. Music is another cognitive ability that seems uniquely human. When did it develop? We have a few bone flutes from around 40,000 years ago, but the human voice is a musical instrument that leaves no archaeological trace. Our ancestors could have been singing for hundreds of thousands of years before they started making flutes. We'll never know. What about burial practices and beliefs about death? The earliest deliberate burials were certain about date to around 100,000 years ago. But earlier, humans must have done something with their dead. You can't just leave corpses lying around. They attract scavengers and create disease risk. Did earlier humans bury their dead without grave goods or elaborate ritual, leaving no evidence we'd recognize as deliberate burial? Or did they expose bodies on platforms or in trees where they'd be scavenged, leaving no evidence at all? Both practices are found in modern hunter-gatherer cultures. Both could have been used by ancient humans. We can't tell. The point is, human cognition is the most important part of what makes us human, and it's also the part we understand least about our evolution. We know our brains got bigger over the last 2 million years. We can measure that from fossil skulls. We know our behavior became more complex and innovative over time. We can see that in the archaeological record. But the actual evolution of consciousness, of self-awareness, of abstract thought, of language, of all the things that make us feel uniquely human, that evolution is mostly invisible to us. It happened inside brains that decayed millions of years ago. We're left with guesses and inferences and fascinating debates that may never be fully resolved. One of the most compelling mysteries in human cognition is the question of what changed 70,000 years ago. For 230,000 years after modern humans first appeared, we were just another human species. Yes, we had modern anatomy. Yes, we had large brains. But we weren't doing anything revolutionary. We made stone tools similar to those made by Neanderthals and other human species. We hunted and gathered. We probably had language and social groups, but nothing set us apart as special. Then, around 70,000 years ago, something changed, and it changed fast. Within a few thousand years, we see evidence of long-distance trade. We see artistic expression becoming common. We see technological innovation accelerating. We see humans starting to expand out of Africa with new strategies and abilities. It's like someone flipped a switch. Some researchers think this was triggered by a genetic change, a mutation that affected brain development or neural connections in a way that enabled more sophisticated abstract thinking or more complex language. The problem with this theory is that we have very few human fossils from this period, and we haven't found any genetic change that could plausibly explain such a dramatic shift in behavior. Other researchers think it was cultural, not biological. Maybe humans had the cognitive capacity all along, but it took time for culture to become complex enough to fully utilize that capacity. Maybe we needed to reach a certain population size, where there were enough people sharing and building on each other's innovations. Maybe we needed some key cultural invention, like more sophisticated language, or new teaching methods that allowed knowledge to accumulate more efficiently across generations. The challenge is distinguishing between these explanations. If the change was genetic, we should be able to see it in ancient DNA. But we don't have good DNA from enough individuals to be certain. If the change was cultural, we should see it spreading gradually from one population to others. But the archaeological record isn't detailed enough to track that spread precisely. Both explanations remain plausible. Neither can be proven from the available evidence. There's even a more radical possibility. Maybe nothing changed 70,000 years ago, except preservation conditions or archaeological visibility. Maybe humans were doing sophisticated things much earlier, but they were using materials that don't preserve or living in areas we haven't excavated yet. Then, around 70,000 years ago, they started living in caves more, where preservation is better, or they started using more durable materials that survive in the archaeological record. What looks like a sudden behavioral change might just be an artifact of what evidence survived. This is the frustrating reality of studying human prehistory. Every major question has multiple plausible answers. Every answer requires making assumptions about missing evidence. Every conclusion is tentative, subject to revision when new fossils or artifacts are discovered. The scientists who study human evolution are working like detectives, trying to solve a crime where 99% of the evidence has been destroyed, and what's left is scattered across an entire continent. They're doing their best with what they have, but they're honest enough to admit how much they don't know. Let's talk about something even more mysterious. The humans we've lost. The species that existed, survived for hundreds of thousands of years, and then went extinct, leaving behind only fragments for us to puzzle over. Because for most of human evolution, there were multiple human species alive at the same time, and we know almost nothing about how they interacted. Take Homo floresiensis, the hobbit, discovered on the Indonesian island of Flores in 2003. These were tiny humans, only about 3.5 feet tall as adults, with brains roughly the size of a chimpanzee's. They used stone tools, hunted pygmy elephants, and survived until possibly as recently as 50,000 years ago. They were alive when modern humans were spreading through Southeast Asia. These two human species must have encountered each other. What happened when they met? We don't know. Did modern humans exterminate the hobbits? Outcompete them for resources? The hobbits lived on an isolated island. Maybe they went extinct due to a volcanic eruption or other natural disaster completely unrelated to modern humans. We'll probably never know, because the only evidence we have is a handful of fossils from one cave on one island. Or consider the Denisovans, discovered in 2010 when researchers extracted DNA from a finger bone and a few teeth found in Denisova Cave in Siberia. The DNA showed they were a distinct human species, different from both modern humans and Neanderthals. We know modern humans interbred with Denisovans because people in Melanesia, Australia, and parts of Asia carry Denisovan DNA. We know Denisovans also interbred with Neanderthals because some Neanderthal fossils carry Denisovan DNA too. These three species were meeting and interbreeding in ways that suggest repeated contact. But we have almost no physical fossils of Denisovans. A finger bone, a few teeth, a piece of jaw found in Tibet. That's it. Everything else we know about them comes from ancient DNA extracted from those fragments, and from the DNA they left in modern human populations. We don't know what they looked like. We don't know how widespread they were. We don't know when they went extinct. The DNA suggests they might have been living in Southeast Asia and Pacific Islands as recently as 30,000 years ago, but we have no fossils to confirm this. They're ghost populations, known only from genetic traces. How many other ghost populations are out there? Human species that existed, but left no fossils we've found, or left fossils we haven't recognized as distinct species. The more we learn about human evolution, the more complicated it gets. The simple story of linear progression from primitive to advanced is completely wrong. The real story is one of diversity, multiple species, complex interactions, and most of it lost to time. Consider the humans who made it to the Americas. For decades, the standard story was that the first Americans crossed from Siberia to Alaska around 13,000 years ago, following the edge of retreating glaciers, and spread throughout the Americas within a few thousand years. The Clovis first model, named after distinctive stone tools found at multiple sites across North America. But that story has been falling apart for years. Archaeological sites keep being found that are older than Clovis, sites in South America, sites along the Pacific coast, sites that suggest humans might have arrived in the Americas much earlier than 13,000 years ago, possibly by boat along the coastline, rather than on foot through an ice-free corridor. Some sites have produced dates of 20,000 years or older, though many of these are controversial. The problem is that if humans arrived earlier, most of the evidence would be underwater. During the Ice Age, sea levels were 300 feet lower than today. The coastlines where early Americans might have lived are now submerged. Any archaeological sites they left behind are at the bottom of the ocean, difficult or impossible to find and excavate. We're trying to reconstruct the peopling of the Americas with most of the potential evidence unavailable to us. And who were these early Americans? We have some genetic data suggesting the first Americans were related to populations in Siberia. But we also have genetic anomalies suggesting possible contributions from other populations we can't identify. Were there earlier migrations we know nothing about? Did multiple groups arrive at different times using different routes? The genetic data is complicated and difficult to interpret because it's been blurred by 15,000 years of population. Mixing and movement? We have ancient skeletons from the Americas, some over 10,000 years old. Kennewick Man from Washington, Lucia from Brazil, others. But these ancient skeletons don't look exactly like modern Native Americans. They have different skull shapes, different facial features. This has led to all sorts of speculation about multiple founding populations, or evolutionary change over thousands of years. But we don't have enough ancient DNA from enough individuals to sort out what actually happened. The skulls are different, but what does that difference mean? We can't say for certain. The same problems affect our understanding of human migrations everywhere else. We know modern humans spread across Asia starting around 70,000 years ago, but the details are murky. Which routes did they take? How fast did they move? How many separate migration waves were there? Did they follow coastlines, river valleys, open grasslands? Different archaeological sites suggest different answers, and synthesizing all the evidence into a coherent story is incredibly difficult. Australia is particularly mysterious. Humans reached Australia at least 50,000 years ago, possibly earlier. This required crossing at least 50 miles of open ocean, even during periods of lowest sea level. They must have had boats, but we have no direct evidence of boats from this period. Wooden boats don't survive for 50,000 years, except in the most extraordinary preservation conditions. We infer that boats existed because humans reached Australia, but we don't know what they looked like or how sophisticated they were. And once humans reached Australia, What happened? We know they spread across the continent quickly. We know they adapted to incredibly diverse environments, from tropical rainforests to the central desert. We know they developed complex cultures with sophisticated art and mythology. But the details of this process are mostly lost. Aboriginal Australian culture is one of the oldest continuous cultures on Earth, stretching back at least 50,000 years. But oral traditions, however impressive, can only preserve information for a limited time. The details of those first few thousand years, how the first Australians explored the continent, what challenges they faced, how their cultures evolved, most of that is unknown and probably unknowable. Europe is better understood because it's been more intensively studied archaeologically. But even there, we have huge gaps. We know Neanderthals lived in Europe from about 400,000 years ago to 40,000 years ago. We know modern humans arrived in Europe around 45,000 years ago. For several thousand years, both species lived in Europe simultaneously. But the fossil record is too sparse to tell us much about how they interacted. There are tantalizing hints. Some Neanderthal sites show evidence of tools that seem more like modern human technology, suggesting Neanderthals might have been copying innovations from modern humans. Some modern human sites show evidence of Neanderthal-style tools, suggesting modern humans might have learned from Neanderthals. We know they interbred because modern Europeans and Asians carry Neanderthal DNA. But we don't know if this interbreeding was common or rare, friendly or forced, between equals or between conquerors and conquered. The last Neanderthals seem to have retreated to refuges in southern Europe as modern humans spread across the continent. Gibraltar, southern Spain, possibly pockets in the Balkans. These last populations left behind evidence of increasingly desperate circumstances, smaller group sizes, more nutritional stress, less sophisticated tools. Were they being actively hunted by modern humans? Were they starving as modern humans took over the best hunting grounds? Or were they just small populations succumbing to inbreeding and random bad luck? The evidence could support any of these interpretations. And then they were gone. By 40,000 years ago, Neanderthals had vanished completely. Their extinction marks the end of over 100,000 years of successful existence. What exactly caused it remains one of the great debates in paleoanthropology. The timing coincides with modern human arrival in Europe, suggesting we were involved somehow. But the mechanism is unclear, and probably multiple factors contributed. Climate change, competition for resources, possible violence, disease, interbreeding diluting the Neanderthal gene pool, some combination of all of the above. What's haunting is that this happened to every other human species, not just Neanderthals. Denisovans, Homo erectus, Homo floresiensis, all the archaic human populations in Africa that we only know from fragmentary fossils, all gone by 30,000 years ago. Modern humans spread across the globe, and wherever we went, other human species disappeared, sometimes within a few thousand years of our arrival, sometimes more gradually, over tens of thousands of years. But always, eventually, they disappeared. Were we genocidal? Did we systematically hunt down and exterminate our evolutionary cousins? That seems unlikely. Hunter-gatherer populations are small and scattered. Organizing a systematic genocide across continents would be difficult, even for modern militaries with advanced technology. It seems more probable that we outcompeted them in small ways that accumulated over generations. Slightly better technology, slightly more efficient hunting strategies, slightly larger group sizes allowing better cooperation. slightly higher birth rates. Over thousands of years, these small advantages would be enough to displace other populations without requiring deliberate violence. But we can't know for certain. The archaeological record doesn't preserve motivations or social dynamics. We have bones and stones. From those fragments, we're trying to reconstruct complex interactions between different human species that happened tens of thousands of years ago. We're doing our best, but huge portions of the story are simply invisible. One aspect of prehistoric human life that's especially mysterious is the role of climate change. We know climate has fluctuated dramatically over the last few million years, oscillating between cold glacial periods and warm interglacial periods on roughly 100,000-year cycles. These climate shifts would have had enormous impacts on human populations. But reconstructing exactly what those impacts were is difficult because climate and archaeology are studied by different people using different methods, and synthesizing the evidence is challenging. During glacial periods, much of northern Europe and Asia was covered in ice sheets. Sea levels were hundreds of feet lower because so much water was locked up in glaciers. This exposed land bridges: the Bering Land Bridge between Siberia and Alaska, the Sundaland Shelf connecting Southeast Asian islands, land bridges in the Mediterranean connecting North Africa to Europe. Human populations would have used these land bridges for migration, but now they're underwater along with any archaeological evidence of human activity. Glacial periods were also times of extreme environmental stress. Temperatures dropped, precipitation patterns changed. Many plant and animal species went extinct or shifted their ranges dramatically. Human populations dependent on those resources would have been forced to adapt or move or die. We see evidence of human population crashes during extreme glacial periods. We see changes in technology and behavior that might reflect adaptations to changing conditions. But connecting specific environmental changes to specific human responses is difficult because the dating isn't precise enough. One of the best studied climate impacts is the Younger Dryas, a period of rapid cooling that occurred about 12,900 to 11,700 years ago. For over 1,000 years, right after the glaciers had been retreating and the world warming, the climate suddenly plunged back into near-glacial conditions. In the northern hemisphere, temperatures dropped dramatically. The climate shift happened within decades, possibly even within a few years. This would have been catastrophic for human populations that had adapted to the warmer conditions. In the Middle East, this corresponds to a period when early agricultural settlements were abandoned. People who had been experimenting with cultivating wild grains suddenly reverted to full nomadic hunting and gathering. The Younger Dryas may have disrupted the early development of agriculture, setting back human civilization by centuries or even millennia. When the climate warmed again after 11,700 years ago, agriculture developed quickly in multiple regions, suggesting people had learned the techniques during the earlier warm period and revived them once conditions improved. In North America, the Younger Dryas corresponds to the extinction of megafauna, mammoths, giant ground sloths, saber-toothed cats, and dozens of other large animal species. Whether climate change or human hunting caused these extinctions is fiercely debated. Probably both contributed, but disentangling their relative importance is difficult. The megafauna extinctions would have dramatically affected human populations who had been hunting these animals. How they adapted, what happened to populations that depended heavily on megafauna, these questions remain poorly understood. There's also controversial evidence for a cosmic impact at the start of the Younger Dryas. Some researchers have found microscopic diamonds, magnetic spherules, and other materials that they argue came from a comet or asteroid impact or airburst around 12,900 years ago. This impact might have caused widespread fires, disrupted climate, and contributed to megafauna extinctions. Other researchers dispute this evidence, arguing the materials have prosaic explanations. The debate continues. If there was an impact, it would have been a major event in human prehistory. If there wasn't, it's still a major climate event whose cause we don't fully understand. Earlier climate impacts are even harder to study. We know there was a severe cold period called marine isotope stage 6 around 150,000 years ago. Human populations in Africa appear to have crashed during this period based on genetic evidence. Habitable areas would have shrunk as climate became colder and drier. But we have very few archaeological sites from this period, so we can't reconstruct the details of how humans coped. Did populations retreat to coastal refuges? Did they develop new survival strategies? Did cultural knowledge get lost as populations shrank? We can speculate, but we can't know. The same applies to earlier periods. Every major climate shift over the last 2 million years would have impacted human populations. Each one represents a crisis that our ancestors survived, but most left no clear trace in the archaeological record. We know they survived because we're here. But how they survived, what strategies they used, what was lost, and what was preserved, most of that information is gone. There's one more major gap in human prehistory that deserves attention: the development of agriculture. For 95% of human existence, we were hunter-gatherers. We lived in small mobile groups, following animal herds and seasonal plant resources, moving constantly, never settling in one place for long. Then, around 12,000 years ago, some human groups started deliberately cultivating plants and domesticating animals. Within a few thousand years, agriculture had developed independently in at least 7 different regions around the world: the Middle East, China, Mesoamerica, the Andes, the eastern United States, New Guinea, and Africa. This transition from hunting and gathering to agriculture is arguably the most important event in human history. Agriculture allowed higher population densities. It enabled permanent settlements that grew into villages, then towns, then cities. It created food surpluses that could support specialized craftspeople, soldiers, priests, rulers. It led to social stratification, organized religion, writing, mathematics, all the complex cultural innovations we associate with civilization. Everything about modern human life traces back to that transition to agriculture 12,000 years ago. So, how did it happen? Why did people who had been successfully hunting and gathering for hundreds of thousands of years suddenly decide to start farming? The honest answer is we don't really know. The archaeological evidence shows that agriculture developed, but it doesn't explain why. Several theories have been proposed. Maybe population growth created pressure to intensify food production. Maybe climate change, after the end of the Ice Age, created conditions favorable for plant cultivation. Maybe it was cultural innovation, people experimenting with managing plant resources and gradually developing full agriculture. Maybe it was accidental. People living near wild grains noticed that seeds fell near their camps sprouted, and eventually they started deliberately planting seeds. All of these explanations have some supporting evidence. None of them can fully explain why agriculture developed independently in so many different places within a few thousand years. That seems like too much of a coincidence to be just random innovation. There must have been some common factor driving agricultural development globally. But what? We don't know. The transition happened before writing was invented, so we have no records explaining people's motivations. We only have the archaeological evidence of gradual shifts from wild plant use to cultivation to full agriculture. The why remains mysterious, and agriculture wasn't universally beneficial. Early farmers were actually less healthy than hunter-gatherers. Studies of ancient skeletons show that early agricultural populations had more nutritional deficiencies, more infectious diseases, higher child mortality. Agriculture enabled larger populations, but individuals within those populations were often worse off than their hunter-gatherer ancestors. So why did agriculture persist and spread? Because populations that adopted agriculture could support more people and could expand into territories occupied by hunter-gatherers. Over time, agriculture won, not because it was better for individuals, but because it was better for population growth. But again, this is interpretation based on scattered archaeological evidence. We don't have direct testimony from people making the transition. We don't know how they felt about it. Did they realize they were creating a new way of life that would transform human existence? Or did it seem like small incremental changes, each generation doing things slightly differently from their parents? We can't ask them. We can only look at the results of their choices millennia later and try to understand what happened. So here we are, reaching the end of this journey through the gaps in human prehistory. And if you're still awake, or if you're in that pleasant drift between waking and sleeping, I want you to think about something. Everything I've told you tonight is what we think we know based on fragmentary evidence. The real story of human prehistory is far more complex, far more diverse, far more mysterious than any account can capture. For every fossil we've found, thousands of our ancestors lived and died without leaving any trace. For every ancient tool we've discovered, countless others have eroded away or remain buried. For every archaeological site we've excavated, hundreds more are underwater, or under cities, or destroyed by geological processes. We're trying to reconstruct 7 million years of human evolution from a few thousand fossils and a few million stone tools scattered across 3 continents. It's like trying to understand a 1,000-page novel when you've only been given a dozen random sentences. But here's what makes it worth the effort. Those scattered sentences tell an extraordinary story. They tell us that we're not separate from nature, not above evolution. We're products of it. We evolved from ape ancestors who came down from the trees because the climate was changing and forests were shrinking. We evolved larger brains because something in our environment made intelligence advantageous. Probably social competition. Probably the need to cooperate in complex ways to survive. We evolved to walk upright, to use tools, to communicate with language, to create art and culture and civilization. And we almost didn't make it. Multiple times in our history, human populations crashed to numbers so small that our species could have gone extinct. The Toba bottleneck 70,000 years ago. Earlier climate crises we know less about. Every time, somehow, a few thousand survivors persisted, adapted, passed on their knowledge and their genes to the next generation. We're all descendants of those survivors. Everyone alive today traces back through an unbroken chain to those small populations, that made it through the worst conditions Earth could throw at them. Every other human species went extinct. Homo erectus, who survived for 1.8 million years, gone. Neanderthals, perfectly adapted to Ice Age Europe, gone. Denisovans, spread across Asia, gone. Homo floresiensis, safe on their island, gone. 24 other human species whose fossils we've found, all gone. And probably others we haven't found yet, and never will. All extinct. We're the only ones left. Why? What was special about Homo sapiens that let us survive when all our cousins didn't? We don't know for certain. Maybe our technology was slightly better. Maybe our social organization was slightly more flexible. Maybe we were slightly better at adapting to new environments. Maybe we just got lucky. Probably it was all of the above. Small advantages accumulating over thousands of generations until we were the last human species standing. And now here we are, 8 billion strong, spread across every continent, living in environments from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest to desert to cities of millions. We've bent the planet to our will in ways our ancestors couldn't have imagined. We've created technologies that would seem like magic to people who lived just a few centuries ago. We've split atoms, visited other worlds, decoded our own genome, and built machines that can think. But we're still running on hardware designed for the African savanna 200,000 years ago. Our brains are Stone Age brains, trying to navigate a world that changes faster than evolution can keep up with. We crave fats and sugars because our ancestors lived in a world where those were rare. We feel tribal loyalty and fear of outsiders because our ancestors lived in small groups competing for resources. We struggle to think about long-term consequences because our ancestors faced immediate survival challenges where long-term planning meant next season, not next century. Understanding our evolutionary history helps us understand these quirks of human nature. It helps us see that many of our behaviors and biases aren't moral failings. They're evolutionary adaptations that made sense in the environments where they evolved. That doesn't excuse bad behavior, but it does help us understand where it comes from and how we might work around it. We can't reprogram our Stone Age brains, but we can be aware of their limitations and create cultural institutions that compensate. The gaps in human prehistory aren't just interesting academic questions. They're windows into what made us human. Every fossil, every stone tool, every ancient campsite tells us something about the journey from ape to human. And every gap reminds us how much we still don't know, how much we'll probably never know, how mysterious our own origins remain despite centuries of scientific investigation. But that's okay. Mystery isn't a failure of science. It's an acknowledgement of reality. The past is gone. It exists only in the traces it left behind. And most of those traces have been destroyed by time and geology and random chance. Scientists studying human evolution are honest about these limitations. They're not pretending to know more than they do. They're working with the evidence they have, building the best explanations they can, and acknowledging uncertainty where it exists. And new evidence keeps being discovered. Every year, somewhere in the world, somebody finds a fossil that changes our understanding, or analyzes ancient DNA that reveals previously unknown population movements, or discovers an archaeological site that pushes back dates we thought we knew. The story of human evolution is constantly being refined, adjusted, corrected, expanded. It's an ongoing investigation, not a closed case. If you've made it this far, if these mysteries have captured your imagination even a little bit, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment telling me where you're listening from. Are you in Africa, where our species was born? Europe, where Neanderthals once lived? Asia, where Denisovans left their genetic legacy? The Americas, reached by our ancestors in the last gasp of the Ice Age? Australia, where some of the oldest continuous human cultures persist? Your location is part of this story. You're living on a planet shaped by millions of years of human evolution and migration. Your ancestors walked incredible distances, survived impossible odds, and passed down their genes through hundreds of thousands of generations to get to you. Hit that subscribe button if you want more deep dives into history's mysteries. I make these videos for people who find comfort in contemplating deep time and ancient mysteries. For people who like falling asleep to stories about things that happened so long ago that all urgency has drained away, leaving only wonder. For people who appreciate that some of the most interesting questions are the ones we can't answer yet, and maybe never will. If you're drifting off to sleep now, let these thoughts follow you into your dreams. Imagine the first humans walking upright across the African plains. Picture Homo erectus spreading across Asia, adapting to new environments their ancestors had never seen. Wonder about Neanderthals sitting around fires in their caves, the last of their kind, as modern humans spread across their territory. Think about the small groups of survivors who made it through the Toba catastrophe, the bottleneck that nearly ended our species before we'd really begun. You are the product of the most successful survival story in history. Every one of your ancestors, going back millions of years, survived long enough to reproduce. Through predators and diseases, through climate shifts and food shortages, through competition with other human species, and the simple day-to-day dangers of life before modern medicine and agriculture and safety regulations. An unbroken chain of survivors led from the first upright apes to you. That's not just interesting trivia, that's profound. You're here because of one of the luckiest streaks in the history of evolution. And the story isn't over. Human evolution hasn't stopped. It's just changed. We're not adapting biologically anymore. We're adapting culturally. Every generation builds on the knowledge of the previous one. Every discovery opens new questions. Every answer reveals deeper mysteries. The human story that began 7 million years ago in Africa is still being written. We're part of it. We're the current chapter. And whatever happens next, whether we spread to other worlds, or destroy ourselves, or transform into something we can't currently imagine, we'll carry with us the legacy of those ancient ancestors. The ones who survived when survival seemed impossible. The ones who kept going when other species gave up. The ones who looked at the night sky and wondered what was out there. Who looked at stone and saw tools. Who looked at each other and developed language and culture and everything that makes us human. But before we drift off completely, let's explore some of the specific mysteries that haunt researchers. Because it's in these details, these specific unanswered questions, that we really get a sense of how much we don't know. Consider stone tool technology. For over 2 million years, this was humanity's primary technology. Every human population we know about made stone tools, and the evolution of stone tool technology should tell us something about the evolution of human cognition and culture. It should be a window into how our ancestors thought and learned and innovated. But the story is far more complicated than it first appears. The oldest stone tools we've found come from sites in Kenya and Ethiopia, dated to about 3.3 million years ago. These are called Lomekwian tools, and they're incredibly simple. Large stones struck against other stones to create sharp flakes. No careful shaping, no standardized forms, just functional sharp edges. We don't even know which species made them. Australopithecus, early Homo, some other human ancestor. The sites don't have fossils directly associated with the tools. We just have the tools themselves, sitting in ancient sediments, silent witnesses to behavior we can barely understand. Then, around 2.6 million years ago, we get older one tools, slightly more sophisticated. These show more control, more intentionality. The makers were selecting specific types of stone, striking flakes off in predictable patterns, creating cores that could be used as tools and flakes that could be used as cutting edges. Older one tools are found at sites across East Africa, often associated with animal bones that show cut marks. Our ancestors were using these tools to butcher meat, probably scavenging from predator kills initially, later hunting their own prey. But here's what's interesting. Older one technology persisted with minimal change for about 1 million years. 1 million years of making essentially the same tools, using the same techniques. That's 40,000 generations of humans teaching their children how to make the same stone tools their ancestors had been making. Where was the innovation? Where was the improvement? Some researchers think this indicates that early humans had limited cognitive abilities, that they could learn a complex task but couldn't innovate or improve it. Others think it indicates that Oldowan technology was so effective for their needs that there was no pressure to change it. Why fix what isn't broken? Then, around 1.7 million years ago, we get the sudden appearance of Acheulean hand axes. And these are dramatic improvements. They're symmetrical, carefully shaped, requiring complex planning and execution. You can't make an Acheulean hand axe by randomly striking stones together. You need to envision the final form, select the right starting material, remove flakes in a specific sequence to achieve bilateral symmetry and a sharp perimeter edge. It's cognitively demanding work. And yet, once Acheulean technology appeared, it also persisted, largely unchanged, for over 1 million years. Hand axes from 1.7 million years ago look remarkably similar to hand axes from 300,000 years ago. Yes, there were regional variations. Yes, there were slight improvements in technique, but the fundamental design remained constant. Again, 40,000 generations making the same tool. This suggests something important about how knowledge was transmitted in these ancient populations. They were conservative, sticking with proven techniques rather than experimenting with new ones. This conservatism makes sense from a survival perspective. If you've got a tool design that works, teaching your children to make that design ensures they'll have functional tools. Experimenting with new designs carries risk. Most innovations probably made tools worse, not better. And in a world where a bad tool could mean starvation, conservatism was adaptive. Better to stick with what works than risk failure trying something new. But it also suggests that these early humans might have lacked some cognitive abilities we take for granted. Modern humans are compulsive innovators. We can't help but tinker, experiment, try new approaches. We see a problem and immediately start brainstorming solutions. Even when we have something that works, we try to improve it. This drive to innovate is one of the defining characteristics of modern human cognition, and it seems to have been much weaker or absent in earlier human species. Around 300,000 years ago, stone tool technology starts becoming more diverse. We see the appearance of prepared core techniques, where stone knappers would carefully shape a core, then strike off flakes that were already the desired shape and size. This is more efficient and produces higher quality tools, but it requires even more planning and cognitive sophistication than hand axes did. You're not just shaping one tool, you're shaping a core specifically to produce multiple tools of a predetermined form. And around 50,000 years ago, we see an explosion of stone tool diversity. Blades, burins, scrapers, points, all carefully designed for specific tasks. Regional styles becoming more pronounced. Rapid innovation with tool forms changing within thousands of years, rather than remaining stable for hundreds of thousands. This corresponds to the period when modern humans were spreading globally, and it marks a fundamental shift in how humans related to technology. Tools were no longer just functional objects, made the way ancestors had always made them. They were products of innovation, experimentation, cultural tradition, individual skill. They were becoming expressions of human creativity, not just responses to functional needs. But here's the frustrating part. We don't know what drove these changes. We can see the changes in the archaeological record. We can measure them, date them, analyze them, but we can't explain why they happened when they did. Why did prepared core technology appear 300,000 years ago rather than 1,000,000 years ago? Why did the explosion of innovation happen 50,000 years ago rather than earlier? Was it biological, changes in brain structure or neural connectivity? Was it cultural, the accumulation of knowledge reaching some critical threshold? Was it demographic, population sizes or densities reaching levels that supported more innovation? We can propose theories, but we can't test them definitively because the evidence isn't there. The same problem affects our understanding of other technologies. Take fire. Fire use was transformative for human evolution. It provided warmth, allowing humans to live in colder climates. It provided light, extending the day beyond sunset. It protected against predators. It could be used to process food, making tough plants and meat more digestible, and killing parasites. It enabled social gathering after dark, probably facilitating language development and social bonding. Fire use was a game changer. But when did humans first control fire? We have evidence of fire at human sites going back at least 400,000 years. Hearths, charred bones, burned stone tools. By that time, humans were clearly using fire regularly. But was it controlled fire, or just opportunistic use of natural wildfires? And when did fire use begin? There are controversial claims of much earlier fire use. Sites in Africa with burned sediments dated to over 1,000,000 years ago. But natural fires occur. Distinguishing human-controlled fires from natural fires in ancient sites is incredibly difficult. Some researchers think humans might have been using fire for over 1,000,000 years, since the time of Homo erectus. The evidence is the geographic spread of Homo erectus into colder climates, where survival without fire would be very difficult. If they could live in China and Java and eventually Indonesia, they probably had fire. But we don't have clear archaeological evidence of controlled fire from these early sites. The fires might not have left traces that survived, or humans might have been tough enough to survive without fire, huddling together for warmth, using caves and shelters. We can't know for certain. What about clothing? When did humans start wearing clothes? This is another transformative technology that left almost no archaeological trace. Clothing doesn't fossilize, except in the most extraordinary circumstances. We have a few pieces of ancient textiles from dry caves. The oldest may be 7,000 years old. But humans were almost certainly wearing some form of clothing long before that. We moved into cold climates where nakedness would be fatal. We must have been wearing something. Animal hides, woven plant fibers, something. Genetic analysis of clothing lice, which are distinct from head lice and specifically adapted to living in clothing, suggests humans might have been wearing clothes regularly for over 100,000 years. But that's a genetic estimate with large error bars. The actual origin of clothing could be much older, and we have no idea what early clothing looked like. Simple wraps, sewn garments, something else. All of it is speculation. The same applies to shelters. When did humans start building structures? We have evidence of simple windbreaks and shelters made from branches and animal hides going back at least 400,000 years. But these structures don't preserve well. Wood rots, hides decay, stone arrangements can be disturbed by natural processes. We probably find only a tiny fraction of the shelters ancient humans built. Earlier, humans might have been building shelters for hundreds of thousands of years before that, shelters that left no archaeological trace at all. Let's talk about something even more speculative: social structure. How were prehistoric human groups organized? Were they egalitarian or hierarchical? How did they choose leaders? How did they resolve conflicts? How did they divide labor? All of this is invisible in the archaeological record. We can look at modern hunter-gatherer societies and make comparisons. But that's problematic. Modern hunter-gatherers are modern people with modern cultures. They've had just as much time to evolve culturally as we have. They're not living fossils. They're not unchanged remnants of the Paleolithic. They're contemporary people adapting to contemporary conditions, using strategies that make sense in their current environments. Still, looking at modern hunter-gatherers can give us ideas about what might have been possible in the past. Most hunter-gatherer societies are relatively egalitarian. They don't have permanent leaders or rigid hierarchies. Decisions are made through consensus. Resources are shared. Prestige goes to skilled hunters or healers, or those with valuable knowledge. But that prestige doesn't translate into power over others. This makes sense for mobile groups without stored resources. There's nothing to monopolize, no way to enforce authority, no reason for rigid hierarchies. But was this true for all prehistoric humans? We don't know. Some archaeological sites show evidence that might suggest early forms of social hierarchy. Burials where some individuals have more grave goods than others, suggesting differential status. Sites with structures that might have been communal gathering places or ritual centers, suggesting organized group activities. But interpreting these findings is difficult. Does a burial with more grave goods indicate higher social status, or just that this individual had family who cared enough to include more objects? Does a structure used for gatherings indicate hierarchy, or just community cooperation? We also don't know how prehistoric humans handled mating and reproduction. Were they monogamous, pairing off into couples? Polygamous, with high-status males having multiple partners? Something else entirely. Modern humans show enormous variation in mating systems across different cultures. Prehistoric humans probably did too, but we have no way to determine this from fossils and stone tools. What about conflict and violence? there's evidence that prehistoric humans sometimes engaged in violence. Skeletal remains with injuries from weapons, sites that might have been fortified. But interpreting this evidence is contentious. Was violence common or rare? Was it between groups or within groups? Was it ritualized or serious warfare? Some researchers think prehistoric humans were relatively peaceful, with violence rare and usually the result of personal disputes rather than organized warfare. Others think violence was common, with different groups competing fiercely for territory and resources. The evidence can support either interpretation, depending on which sites you emphasize and how you interpret ambiguous findings. There's also the question of ritual and belief. When did humans develop religious or spiritual beliefs? We see evidence of intentional burial going back at least 100,000 years, and probably much earlier. Burials suggest belief in an afterlife, or at least that death has social significance beyond simple disposal of bodies. We see evidence of art and symbolism going back at least 50,000 years. Art often has ritual or religious significance. But what exactly were ancient humans believing? What stories were they telling about the world? What supernatural forces did they imagine? All of this is lost. Belief systems don't fossilize. Even with more recent prehistoric peoples, those who lived just thousands of years ago, rather than hundreds of thousands, we struggle to understand their beliefs. We have their art, their sacred sites, sometimes elaborate burial practices. But we can't interview them. We can't ask what they believed. We can only look at what they left behind and guess. And often, our guesses say more about our own beliefs and assumptions than about theirs. Take the cave paintings of Europe, the famous Lascaux and Altamira caves, with their stunning depictions of animals. What were these for? Hunting magic? Creating images of prey to ensure successful hunts? Shamanic visions? Recording experiences from altered states of consciousness? Storytelling? Illustrating narratives about ancestors or mythological events? Simple art for art's sake, created because humans enjoy creating. All of these interpretations have been proposed. All of them might have some truth, or none of them. We don't know. The painters are gone, their languages forgotten, their beliefs lost. Let's shift perspective and think about specific regions and how human prehistory unfolded differently in different places. Because one thing that's clear from the archaeological record is that human evolution wasn't uniform. Different populations adapted to different environments in different ways, and many of these regional variations are poorly understood because the archaeological record is even more fragmentary once you look at specific regions rather than global patterns. Start with Africa, where humans evolved. But Africa is enormous, the second largest continent, with incredible environmental diversity. Human evolution in East Africa, where we have most of our early fossils, might have been very different from human evolution in West Africa, or South Africa, or North Africa, where we have far fewer fossils. Most human fossils come from the East African Rift Valley, because the volcanic activity there created excellent conditions for fossilization. Ash falls buried sites quickly. Rapid sedimentation preserved bones. Subsequent geological uplift exposed ancient layers for us to find. But humans didn't only live in the Rift Valley. They lived across Africa in forests, savannas, coasts, mountains. The populations living in these other environments probably evolved differently, adapted to different conditions, developed different behaviors. But we have very few fossils from most of Africa, We're reconstructing human evolution primarily from the Rift Valley populations, and assuming that's representative of all early humans. But that's a huge assumption. It's like trying to understand modern human diversity by only studying people in one specific region. West Africa, in particular, is a massive blind spot. The tropical forests and high rainfall mean organic materials decay rapidly, and fossilization is rare. We have almost no human fossils from West Africa before the last few thousand years. But genetic studies of modern West African populations suggest they have deep roots, lineages that separated from East African populations hundreds of thousands of years ago. This means there were human populations living in West Africa throughout most of human evolution, but they're almost completely invisible in the fossil record. What did they look like? How did they adapt to forest environments? What technologies did they develop? We don't know. The evidence rotted away millennia ago. The same problem exists in Southeast Asia. We know Homo erectus reached Java by 1.5 million years ago and survived there until possibly as recently as 110,000 years ago. But we have maybe a dozen fossil sites from Java spanning over 1 million years. What happened in between? How did these populations change over time? How did they interact with other human species that also lived in Southeast Asia? Did they have contact with populations in mainland Asia, or were they isolated on their islands? The gaps are enormous. The discovery of Homo floresiensis, the hobbit, showed just how much we're missing. Here was an entire species of human living on an Indonesian island, surviving until 50,000 years ago, and we had no idea they existed until 2003, when their fossils were discovered. They were so different from other humans, tiny bodies, tiny brains, that some researchers initially thought they must be modern humans with some pathological condition. But more fossils confirmed they were a distinct species, probably descended from Homo erectus populations that reached the island and then evolved smaller body size over hundreds of thousands of years, possibly due to island dwarfism, where large animals on islands evolve smaller sizes due to limited resources. But here's what keeps me up at night about Homo floresiensis. They were only discovered because a team happened to excavate in one specific cave on one specific island. How many other isolated human populations existed that we haven't found? Southeast Asia has thousands of islands. During the Ice Age, when sea levels were lower, many of these were connected to the mainland or to each other, but some remained isolated. Human populations could have reached these islands, become isolated, evolved into distinct forms, and then gone extinct without leaving fossils in places we've searched. The same could be true for Africa or any other region. We've excavated such a tiny fraction of potential archaeological sites. We've searched thoroughly in a few areas and barely touched most of the world. Every year, new sites are discovered that change our understanding. But we have to acknowledge that most sites will never be found. They're underwater due to sea level rise. They're buried under cities or farmland where we can't excavate. They're in politically unstable regions where archaeological work is dangerous or impossible. They've been destroyed by erosion or geological processes. The fossils and artifacts that survived are a tiny, non-random sample of what once existed, and we're trying to reconstruct human prehistory from that sample. Consider the Pacific Islands. Humans reached these islands starting around 50,000 years ago with the settlement of Australia and New Guinea. But the more distant Pacific Islands weren't settled until much more recently, mostly within the last 3,000 years. The voyages that settled these islands required sophisticated boats, expert navigation, and willingness to sail hundreds of miles across open ocean with no guarantee of finding land. These were some of the greatest feats of exploration and seamanship in human history. But we have very limited archaeological evidence of how this happened. Boats don't preserve for thousands of years. Navigation techniques were passed down orally. No written records. We know the islands were settled because people got there somehow. We can use genetic analysis and linguistic analysis to track where settlers came from and when. But the actual voyages, the boats people used, the navigation methods they employed, how they decided where to sail, how many voyages failed with all hands lost, all of this is mostly unknown, and many Pacific Island cultures had no writing, so their early history exists only in oral tradition. Oral traditions can preserve information for many generations, but they change over time. Details are added, removed, altered. By the time European explorers arrived and started recording these traditions, the settling of the islands had happened centuries or even millennia earlier. The oral accounts had been passed down through dozens of generations. How much had changed? How much was historical memory, and how much was later invention? We can't know. The same problem affects our understanding of the Americas. The indigenous peoples of the Americas had rich histories and complex cultures spanning thousands of years. Some developed writing systems, the Maya and Aztec most famously, but most did not. Their histories existed in oral tradition, architectural monuments, artifacts. Then, European contact in the 15th and 16th centuries brought diseases that killed up to 90% of the indigenous population. Entire cultures collapsed. Cities were abandoned. Knowledge was lost. Many indigenous American languages went extinct, taking their oral traditions with them. Modern archaeology is working hard to recover this lost history. We're excavating sites, analyzing artifacts, using new technologies like LiDAR to find hidden structures in forests. We're learning an enormous amount about pre-Columbian American cultures, but we're also realizing how much was lost in the catastrophe of European contact. We'll never fully recover what was destroyed in that demographic collapse. And the further back we go, the less we know. Beyond a few thousand years ago, the archaeological record becomes increasingly fragmentary and difficult to interpret. Let's talk about something that affects all these regional histories. Language. Language is perhaps the most important human technology, more important than fire or tools or clothing. Language allows us to communicate complex ideas, coordinate group activities, teach skills efficiently, pass knowledge across generations, tell stories that build shared cultural identities. Language made us human in a fundamental way, but language doesn't fossilize. We can't recover ancient languages from bone and stone. The oldest written languages we have go back about 5,000 years. Before that, language existed only in sound, in the mouths and minds of speakers, leaving no trace that survived. We can reconstruct some aspects of ancient languages using comparative linguistics, comparing modern languages to trace back to ancestral forms. This is how we know about Proto-Indo-European, the ancestor of most European and many Asian languages, spoken probably around 6,000 years ago, somewhere in the Eurasian steppes. But we can't push this method back much further. The signal gets too noisy, the changes too extensive to trace reliably. So, when did language first develop? We don't know. Some researchers think language emerged relatively recently, maybe 100,000 years ago, or even more recently, and that this was the key innovation that enabled the cognitive revolution. Others think language evolved gradually over millions of years, with earlier human species having simpler proto-languages that became more complex over time. Still, others think language might have emerged and been lost multiple times in different human lineages, with modern human language being just the most recent and most sophisticated version. The problem is, we can't test these theories directly. We can look for anatomical features necessary for speech, the descended larynx, the size of the spinal canal controlling breathing, the shape of the skull base. These features tell us when humans became physically capable of producing the range of sounds necessary for spoken language. Neanderthals had these features, suggesting they were physically capable of speech. But being physically capable doesn't mean they had language. A parrot is physically capable of speech, but doesn't have language in the human sense. We can look for evidence of symbolic behavior as a proxy for language. Art, jewelry, burial practices. These all suggest symbolic thinking, which probably requires language to develop fully. But the absence of symbolic artifacts doesn't mean absence of language. Early humans might have had language, but used it primarily for practical communication rather than symbolic expression. We can study brain anatomy from fossil skulls, looking at the size and shape of areas associated with language production and comprehension in modern humans. But brain structures don't preserve in fossils. We're making educated guesses based on the shape of the inside of skulls. And we're not even certain which brain structures are necessary for language versus just associated with modern human language. Earlier forms of language might have used different neural pathways. So the origin of language remains one of the greatest mysteries in human evolution. It was certainly one of the most important developments, probably the most important after bipedalism and tool use. But we can't pinpoint when it happened, or how it developed, or what early languages were like. We know modern humans have language. We know it's universal across all human cultures. We know children learn language naturally, without explicit instruction. We know language has specific grammatical structures that are surprisingly similar across different languages, despite thousands of years of independent development. All of this suggests language is deeply embedded in human cognition, shaped by evolution, not just a cultural invention. But the details of that evolution are hidden in the gaps. Another fascinating mystery is the relationship between different human species. We know Neanderthals and modern humans interbred. We know Denisovans interbred with both Neanderthals and modern humans. But what were these interactions like? Were they friendly, hostile, indifferent? Did different human species see each other as rivals, as potential mates, as something other and dangerous? We can't know because behavior doesn't fossilize. The genetic evidence tells us interbreeding happened, but it doesn't tell us how or why or in what context. Was it common or rare, consensual or forced, between equals or between conquerors and conquered? The fact that modern non-African humans carry 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA suggests the interbreeding was limited, either because opportunities were rare or because the offspring had reduced fertility. But that's about all we can conclude. The social dynamics are lost. We do know that Neanderthals and modern humans looked somewhat different. Neanderthals were stockier with larger faces, prominent brow ridges, and distinctive skull shapes. They would have been recognizable as not quite human to modern human eyes. Did this difference matter? Did it create social barriers? Or were the similarities more important than the differences? Two populations of intelligent, language-using, tool-making humans recognizing each other as somehow related despite their differences. The same questions apply to Denisovans, but we know even less about them because we have almost no fossils. The genetic evidence suggests they were widespread across Asia and might have been quite variable in appearance, possibly multiple populations that we're lumping together as Denisovans because we can't distinguish them from the limited DNA we have. Modern humans encountered these populations as we spread across Asia. What happened in those encounters? Were they peaceful, trading partners, competitors, enemies, all of the above at different times and places? The evidence isn't there to answer. One thing we can say is that these encounters ended with only modern humans surviving. Every other human species went extinct. Some of their genes survived in modern human populations, but the distinct species disappeared. This happened over thousands of years, not overnight. But it happened, and we had something to do with it, even if we don't understand exactly what. We were more successful than other human species at something, probably many things. And that success came at their expense, whether through direct violence or indirect competition, or just slightly higher reproductive rates, compounding over generations. This should humble us. We're the survivors. We're the winners. But we're only here because our ancestors outcompeted close relatives. Species that were intelligent, tool-using, language-capable, adapted to their environments. They weren't inferior. They weren't primitive. They just lost in the competition for survival. And if conditions had been slightly different, if a few things had gone the other way, maybe Neanderthals would be the ones telling this story and wondering what happened to those anatomically modern humans who once lived in Africa. Let's consider another fundamental aspect of human prehistory that's poorly understood: diet. What did our ancestors eat? This seems like a simple question, but it's actually incredibly difficult to answer with any precision. Food doesn't fossilize except in extraordinary circumstances. We can look at animal bones found at archaeological sites and see cut marks from stone tools suggesting meat consumption. We can analyze the chemical composition of fossilized bones and teeth to get general information about diet. But the details, what specific plants they ate, how they prepared food, how much of their diet came from different sources, most of that is guesswork. We know early humans were omnivores. Our teeth are adapted for eating both plants and meat, unlike specialized carnivores or herbivores. We have incisors for biting, canines for tearing, and molars for grinding. This is an omnivore tooth pattern, but omnivore is a broad category. Modern humans are omnivores, and we eat everything from predominantly vegetarian diets to heavily meat-based diets, depending on culture and available resources. Prehistoric humans probably showed similar variation. The Australopithecines seem to have eaten mostly plant foods. Their large grinding molars suggest they were processing tough plant materials, probably roots, tubers, seeds. But they also had stone tools, and animal bones are found at their sites, so they were eating some meat, probably mostly from scavenging rather than hunting. The exact proportion of plants to meat in their diet is unknown, and probably varied between different populations and different times of year. Early Homo species, like Homo habilis and Homo erectus, seem to have eaten more meat than the Australopithecines. Their teeth are smaller, suggesting they were eating foods that required less chewing. Their tools become associated with butchered animal bones more frequently. Their brain sizes are larger, and larger brains require more energy-dense diets. Meat provides more calories per unit weight than most plant foods, so increased meat consumption could have supported brain growth. But they were still eating plenty of plant foods. No early human population could survive on meat alone. They needed the vitamins, minerals, and fiber that come from plants. By the time of Neanderthals and modern humans, meat consumption seems to have been substantial. Neanderthal sites often have large numbers of animal bones, remains of prey, animals like mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, wild horses, reindeer. Chemical analysis of Neanderthal bones suggests they were eating mostly meat, possibly up to 80% of their diet in some populations. But they also ate plants. We've found plant remains in Neanderthal teeth and in their coprolites, fossilized feces. They probably ate whatever was available. More meat when hunting was good, more plants when it wasn't. Modern human hunter-gatherer populations show enormous dietary variation depending on environment. Arctic populations like the Inuit traditionally ate almost entirely meat and fish because plant foods were scarce in the Arctic. Tropical populations ate more plant foods because tropical environments are rich in fruits, nuts, and edible plants year-round. Desert populations specialized in finding and processing the sparse resources available in arid environments. Coastal populations made heavy use of marine resources: shellfish, fish, marine mammals. Prehistoric humans probably showed similar variation. Populations in different environments would have adapted their diets to local resources, but we can't reconstruct this variation in detail because most food remains don't preserve. We might find a few seeds at a site, but that doesn't tell us how important seeds were in the diet versus other plant foods that left no trace. We might find bones from large game animals, but not bones from small animals that were completely consumed. We might miss evidence of foods that required no tools and left no processing waste. Things like berries eaten directly from bushes. One of the most important dietary innovations in human history was cooking. Cooking makes many foods more digestible, kills parasites and pathogens, and can detoxify plants that would otherwise be poisonous. Cooking essentially outsources part of digestion to external heat, reducing the work our digestive systems have to do, and making more nutrients available from food. This could have been crucial for supporting larger brains, which require enormous amounts of energy. But when did cooking begin? We have evidence of controlled fire use going back at least 400,000 years, possibly much earlier. But fire use doesn't necessarily mean cooking. Fire could have been used for warmth, light, and protection without being used for cooking. We need evidence of food being deliberately placed in fire, and that's much harder to find in the archaeological record. Burned seeds and bones could be from cooking, or could be accidental, falling into fires that were being used for other purposes. The anatomy of human digestion might give us clues. Compared to other primates, humans have relatively small teeth and short digestive tracts. This suggests we've been eating processed foods for a long time. Foods that have been mechanically broken down or chemically altered before consumption. Cooking would fit this pattern, but how long have we had these anatomical features? They probably evolved gradually over hundreds of thousands of years, so pinning down when cooking became regular practice is difficult. Some researchers think Homo erectus was cooking regularly 1 million years ago or more. The evidence is their small teeth, their reduced gut size, their spread into environments where raw food alone might not provide enough nutrition. But we don't have clear archaeological evidence of cooking from sites that old. Others think cooking became common much more recently, maybe only with modern humans, or even later. The debate continues because the evidence is ambiguous. What about food processing techniques besides cooking? Grinding, pounding, soaking, fermenting, drying. All of these techniques can make foods more edible or preserve them for later use. But most leave no archaeological trace. We might find grinding stones at a site, but we can't tell what was being ground. Seeds, roots, pigments for decoration. Without residue analysis, which is only possible when organic remains survive in the crevices of stones, we're guessing. Modern hunter-gatherers use incredibly sophisticated food processing techniques. Australian Aboriginal peoples had methods for processing cycad seeds, which are toxic if eaten raw, but nutritious if properly prepared. This processing involves cracking the seeds, soaking them in water for days to leach out toxins, then grinding and cooking them. Similar complex processing was probably used by prehistoric humans for various foods. But almost none of this would show up in the archaeological record. We'd find the grinding stones maybe, but not evidence of what was ground or how it was prepared. There's also the question of food storage. Did prehistoric humans store food for later use? Most mobile hunter-gatherers don't store much food because they're moving constantly and can't carry heavy loads. But some hunter-gatherers in environments with seasonal abundance do store food. Native Americans in the Pacific Northwest caught salmon during seasonal runs and smoked or dried them for consumption throughout the year. Plains peoples dried buffalo meat into pemmican that could be stored for months. Arctic peoples cached meat in frozen ground. Did prehistoric humans do similar things? Probably, but the evidence is scarce. Storage pits might have existed, but be difficult to identify in archaeological sites. Stored food would have been consumed or decayed, leaving no trace. We might only find evidence of storage if people stored food in distinctive containers or structures that preserved, and that's rare in prehistoric sites. The evolution of human diet is intimately connected to the evolution of human social behavior. Acquiring food requires cooperation. Hunting large game requires coordinated group efforts. Gathering plant foods is more efficient when groups split up to cover more territory, then share what they find. Processing foods often requires specialized knowledge passed down through teaching. Sharing food creates social bonds and obligations that hold groups together. Among modern hunter-gatherers, food sharing is nearly universal. Successful hunters share meat with the whole group. Those who find productive gathering locations share information. This generosity isn't pure altruism, it's insurance. Today, you catch a large animal and share it. Tomorrow, someone else does and shares with you. Over time, everyone benefits from the reciprocity. But food sharing also creates social dynamics. Who shares with whom? How much? Is sharing based on kinship, friendship, status? Do some people free ride, accepting shares, but not contributing their own? How are free riders punished or ostracized? Prehistoric. Humans must have had similar dynamics. Food sharing probably goes back millions of years to the earliest meat consumption. You can't preserve meat without refrigeration, so a hunter who kills a large animal must either waste most of it or share it. Sharing makes sense. But the social rules around sharing, the obligations and expectations and sanctions, those developed over hundreds of thousands of years and varied between different groups. And none of it shows up in the archaeological record except in the most indirect ways. We can infer that prehistoric humans shared food because we find kill sites with remains of large animals that would provide more meat than a small group could consume quickly. We can infer they had complex social rules because they survived and spread, and clearly had functioning societies. But the details of how they organized food acquisition and distribution, how they made decisions about who gets what, how they handled disputes, all of that is lost. Let's shift to another mystery: migration patterns. We know modern humans evolved in Africa and spread globally, starting around 70,000 years ago. But the details of this spread are contentious. How many waves of migration were there? Which routes did people take? How fast did they move? Did different groups migrate independently? Or was it a single expanding population? Genetic evidence gives us some clues. Modern human populations show patterns of genetic variation that reflect ancient population movements. Populations further from Africa have less genetic diversity than African populations, consistent with small founder populations leaving Africa and spreading outward, losing diversity with each successive founding event. This is what we'd expect from a relatively recent expansion out of Africa. But genetic evidence is complicated. It reflects not just ancient migrations, but also more recent population movements and mixing. Disentangling ancient patterns from recent ones requires sophisticated statistical analysis and lots of assumptions about mutation rates and population sizes and generation times. Different analyses can produce different migration models, and researchers argue about which is most accurate. Archaeological evidence provides another line of inquiry: the spread of distinctive tool types, art styles, or other cultural markers can trace population movements. If we see a particular style of stone tool appearing in new regions over time, that suggests the people who made those tools were migrating. But cultural traits can also spread through imitation and trade without population movement. Distinguishing between migration and cultural diffusion is difficult, and the archaeological record is sparse. We might find sites showing the earliest human presence in a region, but there are undoubtedly earlier sites we haven't found yet. Every few years, someone discovers a site that pushes back the date for human arrival in a region by thousands of years. How many more such sites remain undiscovered? We're constantly revising our timelines for human migrations based on new finds. The route out of Africa is particularly debated. The standard model for years was that modern humans left Africa via the Sinai Peninsula around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, then spread across Asia and eventually to Australia and Europe. But there's evidence for earlier migrations. Stone tools and possible modern human fossils from the Middle East, dated to over 100,000 years ago, suggest an earlier migration that might have failed or left only limited descendants in today's populations. There's also evidence for a southern coastal route along the shores of the Indian Ocean. Humans might have migrated out of Africa along the Red Sea coast, down the Arabian Peninsula, and across southern Asia to Southeast Asia and eventually Australia. This route would have allowed relatively rapid migration because coastal environments are rich in resources and people can follow coastlines without getting lost. But most of this hypothetical migration route is now underwater due to sea level rise, so finding archaeological evidence is difficult. Some genetic studies suggest there might have been multiple migrations out of Africa at different times. Maybe one early migration went to the Middle East and contributed to populations there. A later migration went south, along the coast to Asia and Australia. Still later, migrations went north into Europe. Or maybe there was more back and forth than we realize, with populations moving out of Africa, back into Africa, out again, mixing with each other in complex ways. The genetic data can support multiple scenarios, and we don't have enough archaeological evidence to discriminate between them definitively. The same uncertainties apply to the peopling of the Americas. The standard model says humans crossed from Siberia to Alaska during the last ice age, when sea levels were low and a land bridge connected the continents. They then moved south through an ice-free corridor between glaciers or along the coast. Archaeological evidence suggests humans were in the Americas by at least 15,000 years ago, possibly earlier. But how much earlier? Sites in South America claim dates of 20,000 years or older. If these dates are correct, humans must have reached the Americas earlier than the standard model suggests. But many of these sites are controversial. The dating might be wrong. The stone tools might be natural rocks rather than human-made artifacts. The supposed evidence of human activity might have other explanations. Archaeologists argue fiercely about which sites are legitimate and which are misinterpreted. And if humans arrived in the Americas earlier than 15,000 years ago, how did they get there? The ice-free corridor between glaciers probably didn't exist much before 15,000 years ago. So either humans came earlier along the coast, which is now underwater and difficult to study archaeologically, or they came by boat directly across the Pacific, which seems unlikely but can't be ruled out entirely. Some of the earliest South American sites show cultural traits that seem more similar to Southeast Asian or Pacific cultures than to North American ones, leading to speculation about trans-Pacific migrations. But extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the evidence for trans-Pacific voyages in the Pleistocene is thin at best. Modern Native American populations are genetically diverse, with some variation between North and South American populations, suggesting possibly multiple founding populations, or very early population splits. But the genetic data is consistent with multiple scenarios, and can't definitively resolve questions about migration routes and timing. What's frustrating is that the most important evidence for these migrations is probably gone forever. Coastlines, where people might have lived during Ice Age periods, are now underwater. Land bridges they crossed are now ocean straits. Campsites and settlements they built have been eroded away or buried under sediment. We're trying to reconstruct continental-scale human migrations using scattered evidence from a tiny fraction of the landscapes people actually occupied. Let's talk about environmental adaptation. One of the things that allowed modern humans to spread across the globe is our incredible adaptability. We live in environments from Arctic tundra to tropical rainforest, from high-altitude mountains to coastal lowlands, from deserts to islands. No other large mammal has anything close to our geographic range. How did we become so adaptable? Part of the answer is cultural. We use technology to adapt to environments, rather than waiting for biological evolution. We make clothing for cold climates. We build shelters. We develop hunting techniques specific to local prey. We learn which local plants are edible and how to process them. Cultural adaptation is much faster than biological adaptation and allows populations to colonize new environments within a few generations rather than waiting thousands of years for evolution. But there was also some biological adaptation. Human populations that have lived in specific environments for thousands of years show genetic adaptations to those environments. Tibetan populations have genetic variants that help them cope with low oxygen at high altitude. Arctic populations have genetic variants affecting fat metabolism that might help them process a high-fat diet. African populations in malaria-prone regions have various genetic variants providing partial malaria resistance. These are real evolutionary adaptations, genetic changes shaped by natural selection. But these adaptations are relatively recent, developing within the last 10,000 to 30,000 years. They're also relatively minor. They're not fundamental changes to human physiology, just tweaks to how existing systems work. A Tibetan person's circulatory system works the same way as anyone else's, just slightly more efficiently at high altitude. An Arctic person can live perfectly well in the tropics, and vice versa, unlike species that are truly specialized for specific environments. This pattern suggests that most human adaptation to different environments was cultural rather than biological. We spread into new environments using technology and knowledge. Then, over thousands of years, some minor biological adaptations developed. But the fundamental human body plan remained unchanged. We didn't evolve into different subspecies adapted to different regions, the way many other widespread species have. We remained one species with superficial differences but fundamental similarity. Why? Probably because gene flow between populations prevented significant divergence. Human groups have always moved around, traded, intermarried. This mixing prevents populations from diverging too much genetically. Any advantageous mutation that appears in one population can spread to others through migration and interbreeding. This keeps us genetically unified, even though we're spread across the globe. But this also means we're poorly adapted to many environments we now inhabit. Modern humans living in cold climates don't have thick fur. We need clothing and heated buildings. Modern humans living at high altitude don't have the same physiological adaptations as species that naturally live at altitude like llamas or mountain goats. We need time to acclimatize, and even then, we don't function optimally. Modern humans living in deserts don't have the water conservation adaptations of true desert specialists like camels. We need to carry water and limit our activity during hot periods. We compensate for these limitations with culture and technology. And this has worked spectacularly well, allowing us to colonize essentially every terrestrial environment on Earth. But it also makes us dependent on that culture and technology. A human without tools and knowledge, dropped into an unfamiliar environment, will likely die. We're not generalists in the ecological sense. We're specialists in cultural adaptation, and our specialization is learning and innovating and using technology. Take that away, and we're actually quite poorly equipped for survival. Prehistoric humans faced this challenge constantly. Every time a population moved into a new environment, they had to learn what was edible, what was dangerous, how to find water, how to make shelter from local materials, how to hunt or trap local animals. Much of this knowledge probably came through trial and error, painful trial and error, where mistakes could be fatal. Some individuals would eat poisonous plants and die. Others would fail to find adequate shelter and die of exposure. Others would miscalculate and starve during seasons when food was scarce. But enough survived to pass on what they learned. And over generations, populations accumulated local ecological knowledge that allowed them to thrive. This knowledge became cultural tradition, passed from parents to children, from experienced elders to young adults. It became embedded in stories and songs and rituals that helped ensure important information was remembered and transmitted. But when populations went extinct or were displaced, this knowledge was lost. When European diseases decimated Native American populations in the 16th and 17th centuries, they lost not just people, but centuries of accumulated ecological knowledge about American environments. When Aboriginal Australian populations were killed or driven from their lands, they lost tens of thousands of years of knowledge about Australian ecosystems. This knowledge loss continues today as indigenous languages go extinct and traditional cultures are disrupted by modernization. For prehistoric populations, knowledge loss would have been an even greater threat. Without writing, all knowledge existed in people's minds. If a population crashed due to disease or climate disaster or conflict, knowledge could be lost permanently. If the elders who knew certain crucial techniques died before teaching the next generation, that knowledge died with them. How many times in human prehistory did populations lose important knowledge and have to relearn it or do without? We can see evidence of this in the archaeological record sometimes. The technology used by a population will suddenly become simpler, suggesting knowledge was lost. Then over time, it becomes more complex again, suggesting the knowledge was rediscovered or relearned. But most such episodes leave no trace we can detect. The knowledge loss and recovery happens too quickly, in spans of generations rather than millennia, and doesn't show up in the sparse archaeological record. There's one more aspect of prehistoric human life worth pondering: play and leisure. We tend to focus on survival, on the constant struggle to find food and avoid predators and cope with harsh environments. But humans don't spend all their time on survival activities. We play, we make art, we socialize, we tell stories. We dance and sing and engage in activities that have no immediate survival value. This is true of all human cultures, and it was probably true of prehistoric humans too. But we have almost no archaeological evidence of play and leisure. These activities don't produce durable artifacts. Children play with sticks and stones that look like natural objects when found thousands of years later. Adults might spend evenings telling stories, but stories don't fossilize. Social gatherings might be important cultural events, but leave no archaeological trace unless they involve feasting with animal bones or take place in constructed structures. We can infer that prehistoric humans had leisure time because they produced art. Cave paintings required time and effort beyond what survival demanded. Carved figurines, decorated tools, jewelry, all of these indicate people had time and energy to devote to non-survival activities. But we don't know how much time or how they structured their days. Did they work constantly to survive with only brief moments of rest? Or did they have lots of leisure time, like some modern hunter-gatherers who can meet their food needs with just a few hours of work per day? Different prehistoric populations probably had different answers, depending on their environment and resources. Groups living in rich environments might have had lots of leisure time. Groups in marginal environments might have struggled constantly, but we can't tell from the archaeological record. We just have scattered artifacts that hint at cultural activities beyond survival. What did prehistoric humans think about? What did they worry about? What made them happy? What were their relationships like? What did they dream about? These questions are impossible to answer because subjective experience doesn't fossilize. We can reconstruct their physical world, at least partially. We can say something about their diet and their tools and their migrations. But their inner lives, their thoughts and feelings and beliefs, those are forever lost. And maybe that's okay. Maybe there's something appropriate about the past remaining mysterious, about acknowledging that we can never fully know what it was like to be our ancestors. We can imagine. We can extrapolate from what we know about modern humans, but we can never truly understand their experience. They were people like us in many ways, with the same basic emotions and needs and desires. But they lived in a world so different from ours that their daily experiences would be almost incomprehensible to us. Imagine trying to explain modern life to a Neanderthal. The technology, the cities, the global interconnection, the written language, the accumulated knowledge of civilization. How would you even begin? And imagine them trying to explain their world to you. The constant awareness of danger, the intimate knowledge of every plant and animal in their environment, the social dynamics of a small group where everyone knows everyone else their entire lives, the vastness of an uninhabited landscape where you might walk for days without seeing another human. We wouldn't understand each other. Too much time, too much change separating us. But we are connected. Every human alive today is related to every other human through chains of ancestry going back to those ancient populations. We're all Africans if you go back far enough, all descended from small populations that survived climate catastrophes and migrated across continents and adapted to new environments through cultural innovation. The human family tree branches and spreads and branches again, but it all grows from the same roots. So here we are, reaching the absolute end of this exploration through the depths of human prehistory. And the most honest thing I can tell you is that we've barely scratched the surface. Every topic I've discussed tonight could be expanded into hours more content. Every mystery I've mentioned connects to a dozen other mysteries. Every answer we have raises new questions. The more we learn about human prehistory, the more we realize how much we don't know. This isn't a failure of science or archaeology or paleontology. It's just the reality of studying the deep past. Time destroys evidence. Fossilization is rare. Archaeological sites are scattered and often destroyed. And the further back we look, the worse the problem becomes. We have a decent understanding of the last few thousand years, where we have written records and lots of archaeological sites. The last 10,000 years since agriculture are fairly well documented. Beyond that, we're working with increasingly fragmentary evidence, trying to reconstruct millions of years of history from scattered bones and stones. But this is also what makes it fascinating. These gaps aren't obstacles to be overcome and forgotten. They're invitations to wonder, to imagine, to dream about what might have been. They're reminders that history isn't a closed book, but an ongoing investigation where every generation gets to participate. They're acknowledgements that some mysteries may never be solved, and that's okay. The universe doesn't owe us answers. We're lucky to have as much knowledge as we do, and we are getting better at this. New technologies, new methods, new ways of analysing ancient evidence are constantly being developed. Ancient DNA analysis was impossible 30 years ago. Now it's routine, giving us insights into human population history that previous generations could only guess at. LiDAR mapping reveals archaeological sites hidden under forest canopy. Isotope analysis tells us what ancient people ate and where they travelled. Every year, the toolkit of prehistoric archaeology expands, allowing us to squeeze more information from the limited evidence that survived. Who knows what we'll discover in the next decades? Maybe someone will find the missing link between Australopithecines and Homo, filling in one of the big gaps in the fossil record. Maybe ancient DNA will reveal previously unknown human species or population movements. Maybe some new analytical technique will let us recover information from fossils and artifacts that currently tell us nothing. The story of human prehistory is still being written, still being revised, still full of surprises. If you've stayed with me this far, through 2 hours of gaps and mysteries and unanswered questions, I want to thank you. Whether you're still awake and engaged, or you drifted off hours ago, and this is just background murmur helping you sleep. Thank you for spending this time thinking about deep time and human origins. These aren't just academic questions. They're questions about where we came from, what made us human, what we're capable of. Understanding human prehistory gives us perspective on modern life. All our accomplishments, all our technology, all our civilization, it all developed in just the last few thousand years. For hundreds of thousands of years before that, humans lived as hunter-gatherers, moving across landscapes, following herds and seasons, living in small groups where everyone knew everyone else. That's the environment our minds evolved for. That's the context that shaped human psychology and social behavior. We're still adapted to that world in many ways, even though the world has changed completely. Modern anxieties, modern psychological problems, many of them stem from the mismatch between our evolved psychology and our current environment. We evolved to worry about immediate physical threats, so we feel anxious even when we're physically safe. We evolved to crave calorie-dense foods because they were rare in the ancient world, so we overeat in the modern world where such foods are abundant. We evolved for small group social dynamics, so we struggle with the anonymous crowds of modern cities. Understanding this doesn't solve these problems, but it helps us understand where they come from and why they're so universal across human cultures. And there's something deeply comforting about connecting to this ancient past, knowing that we're part of a story millions of years in the making, knowing that we carry within us the legacy of countless ancestors who survived incredible challenges, knowing that the human capacity for innovation and adaptation and cooperation has roots going back to the very beginning of our lineage. We're not separate from nature, we're products of it, and that connection to deep time, to the vast sweep of human evolution, it puts our individual lives into perspective in a way that can be oddly soothing. So, whether you're falling asleep or still alert, whether you're in Africa, where this story began, or somewhere our ancestors reached after tens of thousands of years of migration, whether you're young and just learning about human prehistory, or old and revisiting familiar mysteries, thank you for taking this journey with me. Drop a comment, letting me know where you are and what time it is. I love seeing the global community that forms around these deep time explorations. Hit subscribe if you want more videos like this, more mysteries from human history and prehistory, more opportunities to contemplate our place in the universe. The gaps in human prehistory aren't going anywhere. They'll still be waiting tomorrow and next year, and for generations to come. Some will get filled in as new discoveries are made. Others will remain mysterious forever, blank spaces in the story that we can never recover. But that's okay. The mystery is part of the appeal. The unknown is part of what makes this interesting. We don't need all the answers. We just need to keep asking questions, keep exploring, keep wondering about where we came from and how we got here. And in the meantime, if you're drifting off to sleep, let these thoughts carry you into dreams. Dream of ancient savannas and the first upright apes. Dream of Homo erectus walking across Asia, spreading into new lands, adapting to new environments. Dream of Neanderthals in their European caves, surviving Ice Age conditions through intelligence and cooperation. Dream of the first modern humans spreading out of Africa, carrying with them the cognitive abilities and cultural innovations that would eventually reshape the planet. Dream of all the humans who came before, all the ancestors who survived, so that eventually you could exist. Their story is your story. Their struggles and successes echo through time to the present. And you're the living proof that it all worked, that the improbable chain of survival remained unbroken through millions of years and hundreds of thousands of generations. Sleep well. Dream of deep time and ancient mysteries. The gaps in human prehistory will still be here tomorrow, waiting to be explored. And maybe, just maybe, someone listening to this will be inspired to become a paleoanthropologist and help fill in some of those gaps. Or maybe you'll just appreciate the mystery a little more, knowing that we're all participants in the longest, strangest, most improbable story ever told. The story of how an ape learned to walk upright and eventually figured out how to leave footprints on the moon. Sweet dreams.